Thanks. So I'm going to talk about some options for controlling water hemp in the spring alfalfa seedings. Dan did a really good job of emphasizing why we're concerned about water hemp. So I'm not going to really go through these issues. I will say that 90+% of the concern really comes from corn and soybean crops is where the concern is. And so I work in forages. So in Wisconsin, that means alfalfa. So the question I really have is, what's the impact of water hemp in alfalfa? Alfalfa is a little bit of a unique crop where we have a seeding year and we have an established year that you can more or less think of as two different crops. And we really don't have nearly as much data on how impactful water hemp is in alfalfa. Well, we have, as a group, done quite a bit of work in established alfalfa, and we have summarized some of our reports, and I believe Anastasia is going to put a link in the chat about that. But what we found is in established alfalfa, we really were effective at controlling water hemp, due in combination to both the just competitive nature of alfalfa, where it grows really quickly, in addition to the rapid cutting in the dairy system. We just don't get that plant to develop a lot of biomass and produces very few to no seeds. It's still present in the corn growing next to it, but because of that alfalfa, we can really effectively control that. So I'm not going to talk about in established alfalfa. We have pretty good results that suggest that it's a good management option by itself, as long as that alfalfa stand has enough plants. But the big question we don't have a lot of data about is, what about in a new seeding in the spring? How competitive is alfalfa, and what are some effective management approaches? So I think here, if technology will work, we're going to have it's working, a poll. We'd like to know from you guys, how do you control water hemp in a spring seeded alfalfa planting? You can pick, I believe, from any of those options. You either don't control it, you use some type of a pre-plant incorporated herbicide, you use glyphosate, post, and Roundup Ready alfalfa, and ALS herbicide. What do you use? And so I think while that goes, that survey goes on, hopefully you guys can give that answer, and we'll summarize that and understand better. I think I know what people are using, but it'd be good to know those results from people online. Okay, I think we're going to just continue on. So what options do exist for controlling water hemp in new seeding? So I pulled this out of A3646 that Dan mentioned. This is our rating system and our herbicides that we use for water hemp. And as you can see, we've got a wide range of herbicides that give us anywhere from a 7 to a 10. We can apply those pre-plant incorporated to alfalfa, such as Eptan and Treflan, add alfalfa emergence up to I believe this is the 5th trifoliate leaf, Butarac after emergence we can apply, and then a lot of others that have other restrictions towards the timing with alfalfa. But the challenge in this isn't really only the alfalfa timing when we apply these. The challenge is also timing it correctly with the weed stage of development. And a lot of times these have different recommendations, and these aren't lined up. So here's some of that information for these different products. I'm just going to go through some of these together just to emphasize some of the differences. So for our pre-emergent or herbicides that work only on yet to emerge water hemp or weeds, we've got 4 options. The pre-plant incorporated ones, we really don't have an issue with because we're incorporating those. Warrant, the encapsulated acetochlor, works really well, but it needs to be activated by precipitation, as Dan alluded to, and many of you probably saw. We had issues with that this year, where we waited several weeks for that activating rainfall. Prowl is a good option, but Prowl is where we have this mix-up with when you can apply it on the alfalfa and when you need to apply it for the weeds. It has only pre-emergent activity, but you can't apply it till after 2 trifoliate leaves in alfalfa. So by that time, that first flush you've already missed. And so that's one of the challenges. For various reasons, most people are relying on some type of post-emergence approach historically. We've got a range of options from glyphosate to butirac, and Pursuiteraptor or Bernoxanil. And remember, Dan mentioned that coelacanth size, 4.5-inch side tall weeds. So that is the case for glyphosate, that's the timing. But the big issue that we want to emphasize for some of these other products, it's much smaller than that 4 inches. It's 3 inches or sometimes even 2 inches or less. So make sure you nail that timing or control will be limited. Then the biggest issue that we need to think about, particularly with water hemp, is what is your status? What is the status of your populations? Are they resistant to these herbicides? We feel that both Pursuiteraptor, that group 2 herbicides, and glyphosate, we have widespread resistance from by water hemp. So likely these aren't an option for management. I will note that several of these have a higher degree of alfalfa injury potential, but we can talk about that in the Q&A later. So what I want to talk to you all about is an alfalfa checkoff grant that we got to look at using alfalfa as a weed management tool. And it has to do with some of these issues that we talked about, that Dan talked about in that one on-farm example. But I'm just going to pull up, we just started this project, so I'm just going to show you some of the data related to alfalfa productivity. How we did this experiment, we did this in 3 locations. I'm just going to talk to you about Wisconsin this spring. We established plots in the spring, and I'm going to talk about 3 of the different treatments we used. Warrant, which we applied when the alfalfa emerged. Butirac at the 2-inch tall weeds, 2 to 3 inch tall weeds. And we had another treatment where we added Prowl H2O at that time as well. And we're going to show you those results. And we did a bunch of measurements. We're not going to talk about the seed bank. We're going to really focus on the control and the resulting yield from the first cut. So we planted in Lancaster, Wisconsin, 4/22. We got some timely rainfall. The alfalfa emerged right around the end of April. We applied that warrant on April 30th. And as you can see here, no rain for 2 weeks. So what that means is we had no active herbicide, and we had a flush of water hemp 2 weeks early that emerged before we got activation of that herbicide, thus poor control, much poorer than we would typically receive. Then I want to just emphasize we applied the butirac treatments in late May at the 2 to 3 leaf stage. This was the height that we saw of the water hemp, so we nailed that timing. So that was really good, and you'll see that in the results. The bad news is they had an extremely high weed seed bank of water hemp in this field. So literally carpets of water hemp by the time we made this application. So worst case scenario here. So what did it look like? So we came back middle of June, 25 days after post-application. What did things look like? Where we had no control, we had a sea of water hemp. It had topped over the alfalfa and was out competing the alfalfa. When we applied warrants, we did get some control. You can still see the rows of alfalfa if you look close, but we missed that first flush. So some of those weeds had emerged by the time it started to work. In contrast, the butirac treatments were looking great. We had suppressed the water hemp. It wasn't killing all of it, but the alfalfa was on top and really actively growing. So what did that turn into cover? What we see is in the non-treated areas, which are the dots, dotted line, we have essentially 50 to 60% cover that last month before we harvested that alfalfa. The warrants, although we missed that first flush, we still had some suppression of the water hemp, and that cover remained around 35%. But those Butirac treatments really are showing their benefit. We're reducing that water hemp cover down to 10% or so by the time we harvested. How did that relate to alfalfa? Well, you can see those Butirac treatments really look good, and we're getting a doubling of that alfalfa cover over that 1 month time frame from 40% to 80%. In contrast, that warrant treatment went 40% to 60%, so a 50% increase, and only a 5 to 10% increase in the non-treated controls. Let's show some pictures because that's really worth 1,000 words. So here we see the treatments. Here's our non-treated control. You can clearly see a sea of water hemp, really tough to see that alfalfa. In contrast, the two Butirac treatments look great, where the alfalfa is on top of the water hemp and the water hemp suppressed. The warrant treatment, again, lots of water hemp, but we can still see the rows of alfalfa when we're harvesting, much better than you see the non-treated control in the distance where the water hemp has come up top. So we just have first cut yield, so we're going to take a look at those. First off, the overall yield ranged from a little over a ton to 1.5 tons of dry matter per acre. Although you see the bars look different, so there was no difference in yield among the treatments. But when we look at the alfalfa yield, we saw that the Butirac treatments had around a ton of alfalfa that was produced. When we had warrant, we were around 1.5 tons or 3/4 of a ton, so had a slight reduction, although not statistically different. And the non-treated control, we had half as much alfalfa, 1/2 ton. And you can see correspondingly with the yellow bars, that's the biomass of water hemp. And we can see when we're applying the Butirac, we're keeping that biomass of weeds to around 10% or so in that first cut. Whereas with the warrant, it's around 50-50. And the non-treated, we have more water hemp than we have alfalfa in that first biomass. So that's some of the results from the first cut. You may be wondering, man, we're probably getting a big hit on alfalfa stand density from these treatments. Our initial results are showing no significant difference in losses in stand and alfalfa plant density from any of the treatments. Although you can see a trend with lower plants. My guess is with this frequent harvest, the alfalfa stands will look great. So what can we conclude from this data? Well, the first conclusion that we can make from the first cut is that Butirac at 2 quarts per acre worked well at effectively controlling water hemp. Warrant gave partial control. I really feel that that's due to that lack of activating precip right after we sprayed. And in combination, we had that water hemp for some reason emerged a week to 2 weeks earlier. So that 1-2 punch really gave us poor control that we haven't seen before with warrant. So the big question is, how does these results, or how are they going to impact nutritive value of the forage and milk production? Well, those non-treated controls and warrants, we're going to likely get an impact on that. Typically around 20% or more biomass of weeds in your yield is going to reduce your milk production. But those Butirac treatments, we're probably not going to see a difference, particularly if we harvest those in a timely fashion, because it was around 10% and below that 20% level. So that's the good news. We do have some future questions we want to answer with this research. We're interested in how it's going to control the future harvests, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. And obviously, we added prowl in that one. We're curious if there's any value in adding prowl, or is that not giving us any improvement in long-term control? Okay, let's look at some pictures. So we went in 2 weeks after harvest and took some pictures. On your right, this is what the non-treated control looked like in June, a seed. A month later, it looks great. We have alfalfa way up above that water hemp and mostly alfalfa. If you look in deep, you'll see lots of little water hemp plants that are growing. Those are likely ones that were too low to be harvested. Those larger ones look to have been senesced and controlled. The warrant similarly looks really good compared to the initial treatments. Like the untreated control, we are seeing significant seedlings that are present in there. at a slightly lower density, but similar to the control. But alfalfa stands look really good. How about those Butirac treatments? They look good in the middle of June, and they're continuing to look good in July. We're not seeing a lot of seedlings that have emerged. I think we got really good control and not seeing some of those later flushes. We do see an occasional water hemp plant here or there, but much lower density than we're seeing in the warrant and the non-treated control. And same story with the Butirac and Prowl. Again, they look very similar to the other ones as well. So the big question is what's going to happen when we harvest this at the end of these months? And so here's my crystal ball of what I think is going to happen. I believe that, and I'm basing this on some data where I've summarized 7 trials where we've collected weed biomass in the first and second cutting. This is averaged across these 7 trials where I looked at the percent weed biomass in plots that were never treated with a herbicide and compared those to treatments that had the best treatment that was applied during that seedling phase. And what we saw in the second cut is if we didn't do any management in that second cut, we had anywhere from 10 to 27% weed biomass in that second cut. That's in comparison to 50 to 80% in the first cut. So we still have an impact, but it's much less than we see. Whereas if we have really good weed control, it's really a non-issue because while we will get some weeds that show up later, it's in that 0 to 5% range. And the key point I'm trying to make here, what I think is going to happen is most of these are below this 20% threshold of percent weeds in the biomass. If we can keep those weeds below 20%, we're likely to not see a difference. So as you can see in the non-treated ones, we may in some cases see a reduction, in some cases we won't, but we're in pretty good shape with the other ones where we likely will not see a difference in nutritive value. So to kind of finish up, alternatives to glyphosate and ALS herbicides are effective at controlling water hemp and new seedings and alfalfa. Timing is critical for these post applications. If you're going to use bromoxynil or Butirac, and we can talk about in the Q&A the differences between the two. So small weeds is really what's needed. If you're going to use warrant, we need to have that activating rainfall. When we don't get it, our control's poor. I think some of these pre-plant incorporated herbicides can work well in moderate to low density situations. We did have some trials with Eptan and Treflan just next to this trial, and we got around 30 days of control of water hemp. But those weed populations in that seed bank was so high that those populations reared back and were really competitive. So may work in moderate to low density, and these high densities, it really wasn't giving us effective control. The last thing I'll point out is that the injury potential is higher in many of these products, and so we really need to also think about that, particularly Butirac and bromoxynil. These are older chemistries. There's a reason why we've gone away from them. It's because of the higher injury potential and in some cases, reduced efficacy if we miss some of the timings. What are we going to be doing with this one? We're going to be turning our gears and focusing on this water hemp seed bank and see if alfalfa is going to reduce that seed bank and the importance of this first year weed management. Water hemp seeds last 4 to 6 years in the field. If we can keep those fields from producing any viable seeds, other studies have shown 95 to 96% reductions in seed banks. So we're really optimistic. We're going to see a large scale reduction. We're going to be tracking this. We expect very low seed production in alfalfa in the seeding year and subsequent years, even if we don't manage it. So we're really interested to track some of that information. My colleague, who's the head PI on this, Dr. Sarah Kezar, is also looking at using low rates of pursuit when that water hemp is flowering to prevent viable pollen formation and further reduce seed production. So more news on that probably this winter or next spring when we put out those treatments. So with that, I'd like to again thank the Alfalfa Checkoff for funding this. This is a picture of Dr. Sarah Kezar, who's the lead PI on this project, and others that are helping us. And if we have time, I would love to answer questions or hear comments. And I believe we're going to try and do this survey again and see, now that you've seen some of these initial results, how do you plan to control water hemp in spring seeded alfalfa? We have this exact same question, kind of interested in seeing if you're going to change your answer at all. So feel free to answer that question. And thank you for your time. And amazingly, Dan and I did not go over, so we've got a good 15 minutes for questions.